Alright, so again, to start things off, nothing in this video is going to change in 2nd edition. It should be relevant for a long time, and I'll probably only remake it at some point if I can word things better and up the production value. You should know by now, if you've watched the How to Play video, that to make a Mage War deck you have 90 mana points to construct it, or to construct the cards in your deck. And Mage War is a game for 2 to 4 players, but mostly you're building your 90 MP deck for a 2-player game where you just have one opponent. And in this here video, we're going to go over a little bit more about card design. So the rulebook itself is laid out like a catalog of all the different abilities that you can give to cards. And the order it goes in is primary abilities, and then secondary abilities, and then special abilities, and then world abilities, of which there are 2 different kinds. And then, well, they're not really differentiated except for just how they're noted on the card. And then the rules go into item cards and alignments, which of course is what we have here. So the major thing that is noted at the beginning of each section is just the ability restrictions, and for primary abilities, that's pretty heavily noted throughout, and that'll be restricted, limited, or I guess there's greed, which is semi-limited, but most of them are just non-limited, and that means that you can have up to 3 auras and or 3 allies with that primary ability or some variant of it in the same deck. And cards can only have up to 1 primary ability and 1 world ability. They can also have both. Items cannot have world abilities. They can only, of those 2, have primaries. But cards may have any number of secondary and or special abilities. And for world abilities, you can only include up to 3 of each world ability in a deck. I think there's 1 that is restricted to only 1 per deck. But yeah, most of those are 3. And when you write an ability on a card, you need to write it exactly as it's written in the rulebook. So for cycle here, for the primaries, those are all written in all caps. Excuse me. So we've got a DA Shatter, that's another primary ability, that's also in all caps. The 2 different variants of world abilities, you see one of them here, one of them's in brackets with all caps for the spelling, and the other world ability is all caps but surrounded by quotes. And up here, these are all special abilities, so just the first letter is capitalized and they're in quotes. For secondary abilities, it's just the first letter is capitalized and there are no quotes. Let's see if we can find a good example of that. So Mastery. Mastery is a secondary ability, and you just need to remember to write those exactly as they are in the rulebook. Sorry, I'm just reading my notes here. Allies and items that have a primary ability must specify an activation type for any primary ability they have, and that'll be DC, TP, or DA. If an ally has a primary ability that doesn't have an activation stated on it, then it's op activated. Let's see if I have any of those in here. So this, if this was an ally and it just had greed written there, that would be op activated. I don't actually think I have any op activated primaries in here, but you see like there's a TP primary ability. There's a DA primary ability, DA death. And yeah, you'll also specify that for item cards, but they can only have DC abilities. So if an item card has a primary, it'll be written as DC whatever. And then auras must have at least either a primary or a world ability. They can also, of course, have both. An ally must have at least attack defense 1/1. They can not have any abilities. You can just have an ally with just attack and defense, and of course the minimum is 1/1. Items may have at least one trait, but it can be any. So if an item just has an attack defense bonus, that's fine. But it can also not have an attack defense bonus, and it can be giving some kind of secondary or special ability. So like this item here doesn't have any abilities except for just the item wield ability, which doesn't cost anything. It's just part of being an item. And this one has a +1/+2 attack defense bonus. But if it didn't have that and it had an ability instead, then it would just be +0/+0, and then you'd have whatever ability that item granted. And let's also talk here about cycle. So it's good that I have this on the top. So whenever I'm writing a deck list, after I've chosen what kind of deck I want it to be or what I want to achieve there with the build, I start my deck list by naming it, and then I'll leave a blank space open for whatever alignments I end up with. And I'll write auras, allies, and if there's any items in the deck, then I'll write items. And the first card I write is just the cycle, and usually mine are unaugmented, although I think I have made a couple decks where they do something special. But yeah, mostly I'll just write the basic cycle aura, and that's how I'll start every single deck list. And what I've found through all the decks that I've made is that in terms of flavor, the cycle card kind of epitomizes the flavor of every deck. So for example, this here is the Deck of Many Threats, aka Purple Alert. And when I was naming the cycle card, I was thinking, well, what event is setting all these things into motion? I thought it'd be funny if it was a Ground Bogle day, just kind of a magical mishap day where all these things are going wrong. But that's the same, at least for me, for pretty much every single deck that I've made, and all the decks that Corey has made as well seem to follow that. You can build your deck however you want. You don't have to follow that trend, but it just seemed like something interesting that was kind of an emergent property of designing Mage War decks, is that unless your cycle is on an ally or something, or some other way made non kind of just standard aura, that the aura version of cycle is always going to serve as that kind of centerpiece for your deck's flavor. So I thought that was kind of cool. And then once you know what kind of deck you want to build, you can start the list with a basic engine and building around that, or perhaps you know ahead of time what handful of tricks or engines you want the deck to have, and you make sure that those all have synergy and get support within the deck. And that's another way to go about actually writing up a deck list. So once you've got your cycle there and you kind of have the basic idea for what you want your deck to be, then you can kind of go through the catalog of abilities and everything, kind of shop around and come up with a basic mechanical centerpiece for your deck, whether that's some kind of recurring engine, or focusing on dealing a certain type of damage, or dealing damage in a certain way, or if you know that you want to go a certain approach with venom tokens, or if you just found some kind of interaction that you know you want to include in the deck, that's another good place to start. So you can just kind of draft out that card in the list and then start building from there, and it's really easy to get momentum that way. And And this is for all the different types of approaches discussed in the first video for this two-part thing here. So yeah, that's good. And then the final thing is alignments. There isn't really much else to talk about, I think. Alignments are pretty straightforward, pretty simple. You've got your mind alignments and your motive alignments. And yeah, whenever I'm building a deck, I don't build the deck around these ahead of time unless I know I want it to be included in the flavor. For pretty much every deck that I make, I'll make the deck list first and then choose the most optimum alignment set for that. But you can go about that a few different ways, but that's just kind of how I usually approach deck design. And funny enough, it does actually usually work out. Like if I'm making an evil deck and it's doing bad things, then it turns out that the evil alignment actually works really well for a lot of those strategies, whether it's kind of control or aggro, or actually usually it's more control or combo that works with better. Yeah, I've found that the alignments, whether I intend for it to or not, almost always follow a good flavor for the deck. Chaotic neutral being a pretty good example of a deck based on the theme of magical mishaps. So that's pretty much it for this video. If there's any other things you want me to specifically discuss, please let me know in the comments below. I wasn't really sure what really to include in this video. There were a few other topics I could have expanded upon, but I thought covering these kind of basic things that I take for granted when I start deck building, things that I know in the rules, I thought those would be good to go over, like the minimum for an aura, that it either needs a primary or a world ability, being able to play around with that, being able to play around with item cards and allies and all that good stuff. And you know, ability restrictions. Once you build a few decks, you really start to remember which abilities are restricted, and that helps you kind of think about what other decks could be a problem to face for your strategy, and that helps round out the build and make sure that you have all the right answers. Like if you see that there's a weak point in your strategy, then you can kind of build around that. And also, if you wanted to, you know, develop a sideboard for your deck. This deck doesn't have a sideboard, and usually I don't make sideboards for Mage War decks, but there are a good number that I have. And if I ever played in a Mage War tournament, I would absolutely have a very intentional sideboard. So yeah, let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover. Otherwise, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching.